Welcome to the summary video of the Evidence for Evolution chapter. In this summary video, we're going to go over those 9 videos in the playlist again and cover them in some detail. Not much detail, but some detail. If you have the chance, make sure to watch those 9 videos again. But if not, then this should be helpful as well. We're going to go over the first dot point. So this is the first video we cover here. And it says, outline the impact on the evolution of plants and animals of changes in physical conditions in the environment, changes in the chemical condition in the environment, and a competition for resources. So before we start, we're going to quickly go over again what evolution was. So evolution was a change of living things over time. And that time, that was usually millions of years. So most evolution takes millions of years. And so the idea of it was that things can actually change. So animals or plants can actually change over time. So we had dinosaurs at some stage, and we had other things which are now extinct. And many of them have either become extinct or have evolved into different things. So we have the next part of the actual dot point says we need to compare how physical and chemical conditions and how competitions, how those affect evolution. So we go for what physical conditions were again. That was things like climate. So climate is like the temperature or the weather itself. So how many storms there are or floods or anything like that. Movement of continents. So remember, continents themselves actually move. Vegetation. So that would be like plants and trees. Like what kind of plants there are. Is it rainforest or is it more bush? And then we have water that talks about how much water we have, so the availability of water, how much water we have, is it dry, is it wet continent, anything like that. So how do these affect? Obviously stuff like in Australia, dryness is a factor. Most of our plants and animals here are adapted to dry conditions, whereas we have very different types of animals and plants in the rainforest itself. But I'm quickly going to go over this example, which we also had, which was the peppered moth. So you can imagine in Britain before the Industrial Revolution, you had this peppered moth, and you had either the white version with a bit of brown dots, or the black one. Right? And the black, well, that was a variation. So it was the same butterfly, same species, but slightly different, just the color of its wings, and that was a variation. But beforehand, the bird, which is that thing in brown, could quite easily see the black one, and these could camouflage. They could use the house, the buildings, or the trees to camouflage, and the actual butterflies would be dead. Whereas after the Industrial Revolution, when you would have the coal being injected, so many of the factories would produce coal, and that dust would kind of land on plants and trees. And now you have everything covered. So now the black ones are easier to hide and camouflage, and the white ones are seen. So then the white ones were the ones which were killed, and the black ones were the ones which survived. So in a very short time, you start to see a different changing of colors. So first, all the butterflies were white. Most of them were white, not all. And all of a sudden, most of them were black. And that's just the idea of how this can happen, how natural selection can pick certain ones over other ones, depending on the environment, the physical environment. The other one was chemical. So chemical refers to the atmospheric composition. So how much oxygen do we have in our atmosphere? So the O2 levels, how much CO2. Remember, not too much CO2 makes things quite hot. And early on, it was absolutely no O2, no oxygen, and that would have meant no life, or life as we know it today would not have been able to exist. But also we talk about things like pollution and poisons as well, and how they affect evolution. And the example we had was mosquitoes and DDT. And that DDT, that was a poison. So that poison that was used to try to kill bugs, and that was a poison. So what you can imagine happened was we had these mosquitoes, which usually had their nesting area close to a still pond, so a non-moving water area. And what they did, they got this DDT, this poison, and they started to spray the area where we have mosquitoes. The first time we used it, most of them died. So most of these died. Only very few survived. But when they had it again, so when they did it again, a couple of years later, maybe 5-10 years later, very few died. So maybe two instead. So it was maybe one survivor the first time, then there were many survivors. The reason why is because the survivors that were here, the survivor mosquitoes, they had the resistance. They didn't die because they were resistant, and then they made babies, and all the babies were also resistant, or most of them were resistant. So this DDT was a way that we can show how chemicals can make a change in a species. So this new species, most of them were actually resistant to poison, so it changed their genetics. And also how competition can affect it. So competition was regarding competition about food, shelter, space. So for example, we use the example of dinosaurs and mammals. So before whilst the dinosaurs were still around, so before 65 million years ago, and the mammals were very small because they didn't get much food, because the big dinosaurs kind of took all the food. They were the dominant ones. But then we had a meteor hit, right? So a meteor hit, and it killed the dinosaurs. And as you can imagine, now the dinosaurs were gone. So after 65 million years, the dinosaurs were gone, and these mammals were the only ones who survived. So they had much more food, much more shelter, much more space, and they started to grow in numbers and grow in size because they had much more food, much more area to occupy. And that's how competition can either hinder someone, like make a species evolve slower because there's not much food, or if they have lots of food, they can change into lots of different things quite quickly as well. We have this one, which was to model natural selection. So we had to do a model, which a model doesn't have to be realistic. It just has to be able to simplify a kind of an idea. And this was the model of natural selection. So we chose this one where we had 25 Smarties, and it was maybe a party and a kids party, and you had 5 boys, and each of those 5 boys were told they could have 4 Smarties. So 5 boys had 4 Smarties. That meant that 5 Smarties would be left over. So they all grabbed their favorite ones, and by the end, only the green ones were still left over. And that kind of means the green ones are the least favorite, and the fact that it's green, so just a different color, that's a variation. So you can imagine all these Smarties are exactly the same. They have the same chocolate, the same calories, the same sugar content. Only difference is the flavoring. But that slight flavoring difference, that green apple that the kids didn't like, meant that it increased its chance of survival. So the green apple variation was a good thing for its chance of not being eaten. Right, so the green apple was good if you wanted to survive, whereas if you were the blueberry, the red, or the strawberry, you were also likely to be eaten because you were more delicious to the kids. So now if we use that model and kind of apply it to more realistic kind of example, we might have this bird here. Again, that's a horrible attempt at drawing a bird, but it likes to eat bugs, and we've got here 5 bugs, 4 normal bugs and a smelly bug. And this bird would obviously like to eat a normal bug. It doesn't like smelly bugs because it can smell it and it's disgusting. So it'll try to grab these ones and kill them. So it'll eat these. And the smelly bug is the same as our green apple. That's a variation. That might be the only thing that is different. Like it might be exactly the same bug, except for that it smells a bit worse. And that variation allowed it to survive. So in the future, you're going to have more and more of the green bugs because they are survivors, and they can have more and more babies. We also looked at a case study. So it says students will analyze information from secondary sources to prepare a case study to show how environmental change can lead to change in species. So how the environment changes, how that can lead to change in species. So remember, that was the whole idea of the physical condition, the environment changing. So this was the example we used, the kangaroo. This was here a skull of a kangaroo, and we compared the ancient kangaroo, which was around about 25 million years ago. We compared that to the modern kangaroo, which is around today. The ancient kangaroo was a omnivore, which meant it ate both plants and animals, and the modern kangaroo was a herbivore, which meant it ate plants only. And one thing we've noticed with those teeth of the skull is that for the modern kangaroo, they had more developed molar teeth. The reason why is because now we have a very dry environment. It's very bush-like, which means there's much more grass. So it's mostly grass nowadays, and it's good to have more developed molar teeth because molar teeth help with chewing, and they help with eating grass. So modern kangaroos have well-developed molar teeth to be able to eat grass because of those dry environments, means there's more grass. Whereas the ancient kangaroos, they are omnivores and they actually ate mostly insects and small animals, not grass. So they had different teeth. They had these front teeth, which were much more better developed. The reason why is because in the rainforest, so in 25 million years ago, Australia was mostly rainforest. We had mostly insects and mostly small animals, and it was better to have those incisor teeth well developed to make sure you could eat them efficiently. So having incisor teeth would have been a good variation 25 million years ago, whereas having more better developed molar teeth would have been a good variation living as a kangaroo today. And we talk about the evidence for evolution. Describe using specific examples how the theory of evolution is supported by the following areas of study: paleontology, including fossils that have been considered transitional forms, biogeography, comparative embryology, comparative anatomy, and biochemistry. So we've got the comparative biology. That was a study of anatomy, and anatomy refers to bones, so a study of bones of living things. And what we found was that all vertebrates, so all animals that have a backbone, have very similar forelimbs. So these are the arms, so their arm-like part has a very similar structure. We're going to go over that in the next part. We also had the comparative embryology, and that was a study and the comparisons of embryos of living things. Again, when we looked at all the embryos of the vertebrates, and we found that they all look very, very similar, especially the early embryos, when they're only a couple days old. And also they all have gills, so that kind of hints that our ancestor was actually from the ocean, because they have gills, our early embryos. Even the early embryos of humans or reptiles, they all have gills, even though they don't use gills anymore. So that hints at a common ancestor for all vertebrates, and we believe that to be a fish. We had biochemistry, which was the study of chemicals, molecules, and what we looked at DNA and saw that DNA was quite similar for many of our species and animals and plants on Earth itself. We looked at proteins and enzymes and how they also had very similar structures. For different animals, again hinting at a shared ancestry. We looked at biogeography, and that was the study of the distribution of living things. So where we could find, distribution is where we could find living things on planet Earth itself, what kind of things we could find where. And what we realized is that similar species of plants and animals can be found in the southern hemisphere. Remember, the southern hemisphere is kind of Australia and South America. And the reason why is we believe it was once one continent, and then it broke apart, different continents. And all the animals that were in that area are now still quite similar, but a bit different, because they've had so much time apart that we have, for example, the warta plant, we have that in Australia and in South America, but there are slightly different versions. The reason why there are slightly different versions is because they've evolved apart. Same thing with marsupials. We can find marsupials only in Australia and in parts of South America as well. Then we also looked at paleontology, which was the study of fossils. And we know that with fossils, we know that all fossils are found. So we know that the age of fossils, which suggests that life itself was around about 3.8 billion years, so 3.8 billion years old. So that's in terms of how old the oldest living thing is. And we know that fossils have changed over time, so there weren't always the same animals around, and that we can use those fossils to guess that, or to look at those changes. And then we need to talk about the transitional form. And remember this name, this was the Crossopterarian fish, and that was that fish that we believe is all the ancestor of all the vertebrates, the fish which could breathe oxygen and that could walk on land. We believe this fish to be the ancestor of all vertebrates that are on land itself. And in this one we had students will perform a first-hand investigation or gather information from secondary sources, including photographs, diagrams, models, to observe, analyze, and compare the structure of a range of vertebrate forelimbs. And so remember when I said that we have very similar forelimbs, so forelimbs, that was that arm-like structure. and we had to, so this part we had to compare. So compare means similarities and differences. So this was the fish I talked about, that how we think that we descended from this fish, all the vertebrates. So we think they have a backbone that are on land. And we looked at the humerus, so that all have a humerus. Humerus was that top part, so each had a humerus. We also looked at the radius and ulna, which was the forearm, these two bones here, and every different. So if it's a mammal or reptile or bird, they all had that as well. We've got the wrists, so all have wrists. Yep, so all have wrists here as well. And all are pentadactyl. Penta means 5, and dactyl means fingers. So all have 5 fingers, and that is also true for each category of vertebrate. So even though it looks different, they're all very similar. The difference, so these are the similarities, they all have these bone structures. The differences was that bones evolved to suit different animals. So for example, the bones here of the bat, even though they have that same basic structure, they look quite different to the bones of the human. Even though they have those basic structures, they have different functions. So they come in various shapes and sizes now, not just a one shape and size. And they look quite different. But overall, so that was differences, but overall they have quite a few similarities as well. Then it says students will use available evidence to analyze, using a named example, how advances in technology have changed scientific thinking about evolutionary relationships. So we had to have we went through 3 technologies and how they changed our thinking about evolutionary relationships. So before we had these technologies, we couldn't really look at DNA, or we couldn't compare proteins or DNA from different animals. But with these technologies, we started to be able to do that. So we had DNA hybridization, and that was joining together of 2 different DNA strands. So for example, joining the monkey strand with the human strand, not to create a new animal, but just to see how similar they are. So if we had these bases, so if many bases pairs, especially A, T, and the GCs, if they matched as they should, then they have a high similarity. If few of these matched, so if there were few matches, then there are low similarities. But if you're confused with this, just go over that video again. I can't go over it in detail now because I don't want to go too long in this video. And then we have the 98% of base pairs matched for. So the chimps and the humans had 98% of their base pairs are similar in their DNA, which hints that they're very closely related. So we use that DNA hybridization to be able to find out how closely our DNA is similar for different animals or plants. We had the amino acid sequencing technology as well. So amino acids proteins were made up of amino acids, and proteins were the building blocks of life itself. So what you can imagine here is we've got these proteins, and there were 20 different proteins. So there was 20 different amino acids, 20 different types of amino acids, and they're all like a protein itself could be made up of thousands of them. But overall, there's only 20 different types, but you could have thousands of amino acids in a row to make a protein. But this amino acid sequencing machine allowed us to look at the actual sequence, like what sequence they came in. And the more closely the sequence was similar, the more closely they were related. So for example, the pig and the horse, if you looked at the actual sequence, this would have just been a very small protein. Obviously, proteins are usually a lot longer. But here, there's only one difference, which is here we have a brown one, and here we have a pink one. All the other ones are similar. So then we can conclude that the pig and the horse are quite close in terms of their genetic relationship. So they're quite similar. Whereas if you look at the bacteria and the horse, you would find that you have all these different ones, and the only one which is the same one is this. So their sequence of amino acids is quite far apart, so they're not closely related compared to the other ones. Next was the radioisotope dating, and with the radioisotope dating, that was used to figure out the age of rocks and figure out the age of fossils. And the reason why that was important is that if we can find the age of rocks, that means we can also find out the age of the Earth itself. Remember, evolution takes millions of years, and if the Earth itself is not old enough, then evolution could also not happen as well. And then we also looked at the age of the fossils, And that was useful because we can find out the age of bones. So if we found dinosaur bones and we didn't know how old they were, then we didn't know if the dinosaurs lived millions of years ago or maybe just thousands of years ago. But this technology allowed us to estimate the size and the age of all those bones. Not the size, just the age. Next is this dot point, which says, explain how Darwin's and Wallace's theory of evolution by natural selection and isolation accounts for divergent evolution and convergent evolution. Remember what natural selection was? Natural selection was that those 4 points, that variation exists within the members of a species. So we talked about how bugs, there might be different colors of bugs. And then in every generation, there are members that are less well adapted to the environment. So if there were different colored bugs and we had a bird come in, that bird would be able to see all the obvious colors, and only the camouflaged one, which was this one here, would be able to survive. Camouflaged one. Those that survive have favorable variations. So this one, the green one, has favorable variation, which means he's one of the only survivors of that onslaught of the actual bird, which ate all the other ones. And the last was survivors have offspring and multiply in numbers. So those couple green ones that survive, they could have offspring, more offsprings, and which means in a couple generations, in a couple of years, there would be all green bugs. So we started with different colors and ended up with only green bugs. And that was natural selection because these were the best adapted to their environment. And then we had a convergent evolution. Converge meant coming together. So these are different types of species that share similar features because they have the same selective pressure. So I'm going to go over that again, what that meant. So the example was the shark and the dolphin. So the shark is a fish and the dolphin is a mammal. They're not closely related genetic-wise. They're actually quite different in terms of genetics. One is a mammal, the other one's a fish. But they look very similar in terms of their bone structure and what features they have. And the reason why is because they have the same selective pressures, they have the same bone structure, they have the same flippers. The reason why they have this is because they have the same selective pressures. So what pressures they have on their survival? The pressures they have on their survival are lots of water, they need to be able to fast to be able to get their fish, and that's their selective pressures. So they have to be able to survive in water and be able to get their prey fast. So those selective pressures have made sure that only the ones which were best adapted to that environment survived. And over millions of years, that made dolphins and sharks look quite similar, even though they're very different genetic-wise. So that was convergent. If two different species start to look alike and act alike, even though they're quite different genetic-wise. And then we've got divergent evolution. Divergent just means going apart. So it's the opposite of convergent. And that usually happens due to isolation. So if one species is there initially, but then we have a split between, like maybe we gave the example of an earthquake, and now you have two separate islands, two separate areas, and then both those species live in isolation, and over time they become different species. And the example we use with the Galapagos Islands. So we had this one finch here, which was the seed-eating finch. It had quite a sharp beak and a big body, and it lived in the mainland. And after a couple of million years, it decided to fly off. Some of them flew off onto these different islands, and each island had a different environment. One had insects, lots of insects, the other island had lots of fruits, the other island had lots of grubs, and the island which had lots of trees and leaves as well. And what happened is, each of these birds went to each of these islands, but only the best adapted ones survived. So the ones for the insects, only the ones who have a beak, so this is the beak for the insects, only the ones which had a beak that could eat insects would be the one that could survive. So over millions of years, what happened was that we had evolution occurring and new species forming. So each of these islands now had its different species of finch. Start out with the same species, but over millions of years, due to isolation, due to them being by themselves, they became different species. So now there's 5 different species of birds. Then we have the historical development of evolution. So it says students will analyze information from secondary sources on the historical development of the theories of evolution and use available evidence to assess social and political influences on these developments. So remember someone called Charles Darwin. So before he was born, people believed in evolution, or they believed it might occur. So they believed that things might have changed over time. But they didn't know, why it changed, like what the mechanism was that made them change over the years. So evolution was kind of semi-accepted, but no one really knew, why they changed. Like why were they all not always the same? And that was what Charles Darwin came up with. So he was born in 1809, but he left England in 1831. And he went on his 6-year voyage. So voyage was that boat trip. So he came back in 1836. In his voyage, he left England and went all the way around South America and came back the other way, past Australia and back to England. That took him 6 years. And in that time, he collected lots of fossils and other evidence. And he changed his mind, and he kind of realized that natural selection might be the reason why things change over time. And it took him a long time for him to publish. He came back in 1836, but he published his book in 1858 or 1859, so that's 25 years later. And the reason why it took him so long is because there were pressures on him not to publish. His wife felt he might go to hell if he published. The church himself, he didn't think the church would like his idea. He felt society wasn't ready for it. He felt society would make fun of him if he published. And also his fellow scientists, he felt they weren't happy with that idea either. So he was quite nervous about publishing, and he didn't want to publish. But what happened was this person called Alfred Wallace, he sent Darwin a letter in 1858, so 1 year before he published. And in that letter, he explained to Darwin that he came up with the same idea that Darwin had been working on for 25 years. Even though Wallace didn't realize that Darwin was working on it because Darwin kept it a secret. But Wallace came up with the same idea. And Darwin panicked, so he felt if Wallace was going to publish first, then Darwin would get no credit for it. So as soon as he realized that another person was onto the same idea, he published 1 year later. So he published his book in 1858, 1859. And that's when The Theory of Natural Selection, the book, was published. And he died in 1882 at the age of 73, I think. And nowadays, the theory of evolution is more or less theory of evolution by natural selection. So that was the mechanism. Natural selection is the mechanism. That theory is to a large degree accepted by most people.